Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We live in a world just flooded with information, right? Our mission is to cut through that noise, give you the clear understanding you need, fast. Today, we're diving into the really intricate dance of global powers. We're focusing on recent developments mixing trade, energy, and defense. The big question really is, are these economic pressures, this military posturing, are they signs of some kind of calculated new global order, or is it a dangerous escalation, maybe risking wider instability? We'll unpack some critical statements, proposed actions from major global players, and really try to explore what they mean for the international landscape right now.
Yeah, and what's really striking is just how fast things are shifting in international relations. You see announcements that seem separate, but when you look closer, well, when you connect the dots, they often reveal these deeply interconnected strategies, and they're actively reshaping the whole geopolitical map. That's what we'll dig into.
Okay, so let's jump right in. A prime example of this interplay. The recent tension around India's energy purchases from Russia. U.S. President Trump has made some, well, pretty strong accusations. And he's even threatened tariffs over India importing Russian oil. This isn't just a minor trade spat, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. And India, they have a very clear, quite compelling response to this. They stated they were basically compelled to buy oil from Russia. Why? Because their usual suppliers, well, they redirected shipments to Europe after the conflict in Ukraine started. And what's more, India pointed out something interesting. The U.S. itself had previously encouraged these purchases, to stabilize global energy markets when prices were going through the roof.
Right, and India didn't just defend itself. They sort of turned the tables a little. They put forward a strong counter-argument, pointing out that the very countries criticizing them are, well, still trading with Russia themselves. India's message was pretty clear. Our trade is driven by a vital national need securing stable, affordable energy for our huge population. It's about basic energy security.
Exactly. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, India specifically mentioned the European Union, still buying Russian energy, fertilizers, even metallurgical products, and even the U.S. It continues to import Russian fertilizers, chemicals, and uranium hexafluoride for its nuclear industry. So India's position is, look, this criticism is unwarranted, it's unjust, and they made it clear they'll do whatever is necessary to protect their national interests, their economic security.
Okay, so India's pushing back strongly. How serious are these U.S. threats then? U.S. President Trump specifically threatened much higher tariffs on India. It wasn't just about buying Russian oil, but also this allegation of profiting from reselling it. We heard talk from the White House, maybe 25% tariffs. But U.S. President Trump himself mentioned like 100% or even 500% tariffs on goods coming to the U.S. if there's no Ukraine truce by August 8th. I mean, that's a huge jump, potentially really disruptive for global trade.
Yeah. And the White House perspective kind of underscores how seriously they view it. Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, expressed, quote, shock that India, who they see as a close friend, kept buying Russian oil along with China while apparently not accepting American products. U.S. President Trump also said it was just unacceptable for India to, in his words, keep financing the conflict by buying Russian oil.
Yet India seems, well, pretty firm, consistent in its position. We heard from unnamed Indian officials, other sources too, contradicting U.S. President Trump's claim that India had decided to stop buying Russian oil. India's Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson talked about a continued, sustainable, and time-tested partnership with Russia, emphasizing they choose suppliers based on price and international conditions. Simple as that. And the numbers, well, they seem to back this up. India's Russian oil purchases have shot up since 2022. Now it's about 35% of their imports. That's roughly 1.75 million barrels a day from January to June 2025. A huge amount. This whole situation with India, it's not happening in isolation, of course. It connects to U.S. President Trump's broader strategy regarding Russia. He set that August 8th deadline for a ceasefire in Ukraine, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is scheduled to visit Russia just before then, August 6th and 7th. U.S. President Trump has been very clear, new sanctions if no ceasefire agreement is reached. But what might those actually look like? How wide could they reach?
That's the big question, right? What would these new sanctions actually involve? There was a proposed congressional sanctions package put forward by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. It gives us a kind of blueprint. And this bill, it wasn't holding back. It proposed massive 500% tariffs on Russia and similar secondary tariffs on goods from any country buying Russian oil, gas, uranium, petroleum products. That's huge. Beyond tariffs, it aimed for asset freezes, transaction bans, targeting high-ranking Russian officials, military figures, oligarchs, and also foreign individuals supplying defense gear to the Russian army. It even suggested hitting major Russian banks like the Bank of Russia, Sberbank, Gazprom Bank, plus bans on U.S. energy exports to Russia, U.S. investment in Russia's energy sector, banning Russian uranium imports. It was really trying to cover all the bases for economic pressure.
And here's where the politics gets interesting. Senator Graham claimed over 80 senators out of 100 were ready to back that bill. But despite that apparent support, the Senate went on a month-long recess on August 4th. So the full legislative package is effectively on hold, which leaves U.S. President Trump to potentially implement new sanctions himself through executive order. Even with the big bill stalled, Senator Blumenthal said, look, even getting a fifth of those measures, maybe 100% or 250% tariffs, would be a significant win, enough to hinder Russia's military machine, in his view.
Right, and besides those congressional ideas, other publications have thrown out different pressure strategies too. The Washington Post, for example, called for maximum pressure. How? Through secondary sanctions on all buyers of Russian oil, including India, China, Turkey, even some EU countries. They argued for showing resolve, even if it meant risking trade talks with China. They suggested sending more arms to Ukraine, too. Their thinking seemed to be that China values its economic ties with the U.S. more than its friendship with Russia. They also suggested trying to persuade Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, to pump more oil if China did cut back on Russian imports. Then you had foreign policy suggesting, well, sanctioning Russian civilian companies that supply parts to the defense industry. Also targeting the so-called shadow fleet tankers, the older ships often used to move oil under the radar to dodge sanctions. And hitting small financial institutions in places like China, Kyrgyzstan that might be involved in sanctioned deals. They stressed that pressuring oil importers should go hand in hand with targeted sanctions on the supply side. They also floated banning Russian metals, precious stones, farm products, and coordinating with OPEC Plus to boost output, providing alternatives to Russian oil. So yeah, whole spectrum of ideas being discussed.
With all those broad ideas floating around, it does seem notable how the U.S. administration has specifically ramped up pressure on India. Why do you think India seems to be such a primary target? I mean, China and Turkey are also huge importers of Russian oil. And we also heard U.S. President Trump threaten BRICS members generally with extra 10% tariffs for what he called anti-American policy. This focus on India even seems to have support from some U.S. Democrats. What's going on there?
It's a really complex question, and honestly, expert opinions are quite divided on the likely consequences and who the real targets are. Ivan Timofeyev, from the Russian Council on International Affairs, a well-known Russian foreign policy think tank, he believes there's a high chance of sanctions if things stay as they are in the Russian-Ukrainian talks. He suggests U.S. President Trump might expand financial sanctions, the blocking ones, or maybe use tariffs as a kind of pretext against trading partners generally. But he also notes that new sanctions probably won't have a huge effect on Russia itself. Why? Because they've essentially been operating in a worst-case scenario environment for a long time now. And the global demand for their raw materials, well, it's still there. So his conclusion is that these sanctions are more likely to actually hinder peace efforts, because Moscow isn't likely to respond well to ultimatums or economic force. But then you have a different take. Fyodor Wojtolowski from IMEMO ran another major Russian research institute. He thinks U.S. President Trump will threaten, make a lot of noise, but ultimately won't pull the trigger on the most severe measures. He sees these secondary sanctions more as a political psychological tool, aimed more at scaring company managers than actually forcing government's hands. He argues that many companies already operating in Russia aren't really tied strongly to U.S. or European markets anyway, so potential sanctions won't cause, as he put it, tectonic shifts in the global economy or block cooperation between Russia's partners and BRICS members. He also predicts new sanctions won't push Russian leadership towards a faster diplomatic solution. He actually thinks time is working against Ukraine in the conflict, and he views actions like, say, sending submarines as mostly PR campaigns designed to escalate tension without really changing the fundamental strategic situation. So these contrasting views, they really highlight the deep uncertainty about how effective economic pressure actually is in changing geopolitical behavior. It's definitely not straightforward.
Right, it's a complex web. And speaking of strategic shifts, let's pivot to another major development. Russia's recent announcement about its self-imposed moratorium on deploying medium and shorter-range missiles. This feels like a pretty dramatic reversal in defense policy, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. A very significant move. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a very clear statement. They declared Russia no longer considers itself bound by its unilateral moratorium on deploying these missiles, the INF range missiles. They explicitly said the conditions that allowed them to maintain that moratorium, they've disappeared.
And Russia was pretty direct about its reasons for this decision, right? The Ministry of Foreign Affairs basically asserted that actions by Western countries are leading to a buildup of what they term destabilizing missile potentials right in neighboring regions, and they say this directly threatens Russia's own security.
Yeah, and this decision comes with some serious perceived consequences. The Foreign Ministry warned about pernicious consequences for stability, both regionally and globally, including, they said, a dangerous fanning of tension among nuclear powers, which is obviously worrying language. Russia stated it now requires compensatory military technical measures to guarantee strategic balance is maintained. They said the specifics of these measures will be decided after looking closely at U.S. and other Western ground-based INF deployments and the whole international security picture. Russian President Putin had already indicated Moscow was developing these kinds of missiles, responding to Washington's actions. And importantly, he suggested Russia might deploy them in the Asia-Pacific region.
To really understand how big a deal this is, it helps to remember the history of the INF Treaty itself. The Treaty on Eliminating Medium and Shorter-Range Missiles, it was a landmark deal back in 1987. The USSR and the US, they pledged not to produce or test ground-based ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 500 kilometers. And it worked for a while. Between 1988 and 1991, almost 2,700 of these missiles were destroyed by both sides. It really marked a less tense era in arms control.
But that foundational treaty started to unravel, really around 2018. The U.S. accused Russia of violating it, specifically citing the development of the 9M729 cruise missile, which the U.S. claimed had a range over 500 kilometers. Then, the U.S. formally withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2019. Russia, for its part, had accused the U.S. of deploying Mk-41 launchers in Romania. These are versatile launchers, and Russia argued they could be used for offensive missiles banned by the treaty. So after the U.S. withdrawal, Russian President Putin signed a law suspending Russia's participation in the treaty in July 2019, which basically paved the way for this latest announcement. It feels like we've come full circle, unfortunately.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to that initial question. How are all these interconnected issues, the economic pressure, the military strategy shifts, raw national interests, how are they reshaping the global order? And maybe more importantly, what does it mean for the future of international relations? It feels like a very fluid, uncertain time.
It really does. And ultimately, I think understanding these complex interdependencies, how one thing affects another, that's really key to navigating the geopolitical landscape we're all living in.
Subscribe to our podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.